timepiece. I don't know if anybody recognizes what this is. For those of you who've had me in class, you know I'm not a total Luddite. My name is Tracy Bach, and I'm a professor here, but I'm a little slow to adopt new technology. My panelists, though, praised me for that. So welcome, everybody. I am really delighted to have you here today. Welcome, Dynda, out in Cleveland, Ohio. She's up there in that little box. Hello. Today we have the opportunity to build on our keynote speakers' comments this morning, in particular about closed-loop systems. Phil would like me to stop.
Because now we have a moment where we're relatively quiet. Dynda, can you confirm that you hear us okay?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you pretty well, yeah.
Thank you very much.
I should also confirm, hi Dynda, this is Tracy. Nice to see you. So Dynda, oh, it's in that mic, isn't it? Yep. That one there?
That microphone is disconnected.
Camera's in the front.
Yeah, so you're speaking
and is
to
the mic in the camera?
The webcam for Dynda.
Okay. So Dynda, can you see the audience at this point?
I can see the panel and the slides that are up.
Okay, great. I was going to ask you all to move forward so that she could see you and see the house. But if you would like to move forward anyway, you are welcome to do it. All right, so where I was just starting off is the opportunity, I think, on this panel about electronic waste is to bring the concept forward from the keynote speech this morning about closed-loop systems and apply it to electronic waste that we're all producing at an astonishing rate. A couple of statistics I'm sure you've bumped into. Something about 20 to 50 tons a year globally of electronic waste is produced. In U.S. landfills alone, we see e-waste representing about 2% of the stream, and yet it can contribute to up to about 70% of the overall toxic waste stream in the United States. And finally, another factoid is that 80 to 85% of electronic products are discarded, i.e. my well-loved dumb phone, not being discarded. And only about 12.5% of electronic products are recycled currently. So clearly we have our work before us in closing this loop, and we have a panel of experts today coming virtually from Cleveland and then here in person. And I thought what I'd do is, rather than doing an extended introduction of each panelist right now, I would just briefly introduce you to each person and what they're going to cover as we go speaker by speaker. So first of all, we're following, as Jack Hornicle very wisely advised us, we're going in the life cycle of products. And so Dynda's going to start us off. Dynda is an attorney, I should use her last name to be formal. Dynda Thomas is an attorney with the conflict minerals team at Squire, Patton, Boggs in Cleveland, Ohio. And she's going to start off with a discussion about her work in sourcing materials and going through the product life cycle chain as she represents clients who are making products with a variety of elements, including conflict minerals. Then we'll move on to our three other speakers, but I'll introduce as we go forward, but we will move toward the regulatory side at the end of our panel. So Dynda, I'm going to hand it over to you. Maybe I should. So Dynda, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much to Jack and others for the invitation to participate in your symposium today. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person, but I'm very grateful to be part of your day today. Can you hear me okay from there?
Yes. Yep. Everybody says yes.
Great, great. All right. Now, as many of you know, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been embroiled in a very long civil war, more than 20 years, between various armed groups and the government. And this is one of the most deadly civil wars in history. Over 5 million people have died, and millions have been subjected to horrendous human rights violations by these armed groups. And these armed groups have been financed over time by the mining and sale of some valuable resources that are very plentiful in the eastern Congo. And in response to pressure by activists, consumers, and non-governmental organizations, and also government. The U.S. Congress required the SEC to adopt a rule that would require companies to do some investigation and then ultimately report on their use of conflict minerals, use of certain of these minerals that are mined in the Eastern Congo. The ones that are covered by the SEC rule are tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. So there aren't other valuable resources are not covered by the U.S. conflict minerals rule. So let's make this relevant. I think as we started at the beginning, if everybody would just take out their cell phone. I'm sure all of you have one with you, or you have a computer, an iPad that you're watching instead of watching the screen. Each one of your devices of this sort, an iPhone or a smartphone, gold is used for the wiring, to insulate the wiring. Tungsten is what makes your cell phone vibrate, either in class or in a movie, and you turn it off. Tantalum is what's used to make the battery hold a charge when it's not plugged into the wall. And then tin is used for soldering. Interestingly, many companies used to use lead as soldering, and then because of the environmental concerns about lead, many of them now use tin, which now has its own concerns. Also, consider how disposable our devices are. If you're like my son, he asked me, when am I eligible for an upgrade? You're always looking for an upgrade. You want to get a new phone or a new device, not because it doesn't work anymore, but because you're eligible. So we're all conditioned to use more and more electronics. And throughout the world, more people are having access to electronics of this sort. And so unless there's some kind of change in the technology, these four minerals will continue to be in great demand. And so now we can go with that little bit of background about the conflict in the Eastern Congo, and then also about the conflict, these particular conflict minerals and what they're used, and move on to the conflict minerals rule itself. The top portion is what I've basically described already before. In 2012, the SEC issued this rule. It took them a long time to issue it. It's very difficult and complicated, and they got thousands and thousands of comments from companies and NGOs about what the rule would cover. There has been a legal challenge to the rule, and a U.S. Court of Appeals determined that certain portions of the conflict minerals rule violate the First Amendment. But most of the rule stays in place. The portion of the rule that requires companies to determine their use of conflict minerals, or the 3 TGs as they're called, and also do reporting, that all stays in place. So for purposes of our discussion, it's interesting to note that there is a legal challenge that's ongoing and hasn't finally decided, but everyone expects that the conflict minerals rule will stay in place. For the most part, exactly as it's currently written. Now, here is a few lines, the 8 lines here, tell what the conflict minerals rule is. It's very short. The conflict minerals rule requires a reporting company, so a U.S. reporting company, that has conflict minerals in a product that it sells, having conflict minerals that are necessary to the functionality or production of that product. And it only relates to products that are manufactured or that are contract manufactured for that entity. So that's a pretty short rule. It took about 350 pages plus for the SEC's release to describe the rule and the history of the rule. But it's pretty short. It doesn't mean that it's not difficult or complex, but the words are fairly short. I would hasten to note, and it's really important to remember, that non-reporting companies are also very much impacted by this rule, because customers will ask them to provide information, or ultimate consumers may require ultimate information about the use of conflict minerals. So the rule itself applies only to reporting companies, but the impact of the rule is much more broad. And I would also say, importantly, I've spent a couple of years working with reporting and non-reporting companies about how to deal with this rule, how to gather information, how to analyze the data, use the data, respond to customers, respond to suppliers, et cetera. So it's very complex and time-consuming requirement onto companies. So here's some key terms. It's really important to remember that the complex minerals rule refers to tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold as complex minerals. That's regardless of where they're sourced. So tin that is mined in Peru or gold that's mined in Canada, those are still called conflict minerals for purposes of this rule. Also, the covered countries, the area of focus for the U.S. rule is just Central Africa. So you take a map of Africa, you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, and each adjoining country. Those are called the covered countries for purposes of the rule. And the reason that they've covered those countries as well is that the borders of the Congo are so porous that there's great ease of smuggling and moving of these minerals between borders. So they really are focusing their efforts on that entire region. Now, the reason that I'm even talking about this issue here is this point right here. The rule itself indicates that conflict minerals that come from recycled or scrap sources are deemed to be DRC conflict-free. That's a very positive result. Positive because it has a good humanitarian result, which is that you're able to state for purposes of your reporting that armed groups didn't benefit from the mining of these minerals, but also because it reduces the time and expense that a company would have to use in order to do reporting about the sourcing of those. So that's a very important aspect of this rule. So what is a recycled or scrap source? The release that the SEC issued discussed that specifically. It says that recycled or scrap considered to be from recycled metals that are reclaimed end user or post-consumer products or scrap processed metals. It also includes excess or obsolete or defective scrap metals. So it does give some definition to what's included in this grouping, and that's a fair amount of detail compared to other terms that the SEC didn't spend very much time describing. Just to give you a sense, I'm going to go through very quickly some places where there's conflict minerals in automotive and also in cell phones. We talked about that at the beginning. But these are not the only industries that use conflict minerals. You would be surprised to find the number of places where these conflict minerals exist, and that's why this rule has had such an impact and why it's been a burden and expense on companies throughout many industries. They appear also in textiles and footwear, diversified industrials, of course, aerospace, defense, medical devices, personal care, food and beverage. You'd be interested to note that Anheuser-Busch did their filing because of the coating in some of their glass bottles. Also, very interesting was the fact that the World Wrestling Federation filed the conflict minerals. And you might say, why would an entertainment group make a filing like that? Interestingly, the World Championship belt that they award, the middle of them have conflict minerals that are included in the belt. So that's a broader impact than you might expect. We've already talked a little bit about who is required to comply, so I won't spend much more time on that. The basics of the rule are to require reporting companies to file with the SEC an annual report that describes the sourcing and use of conflict minerals. That's bottom line. Also, the conflict minerals rule requires companies to make those reports available on their website for 1 year. So the point is to name and shame, or the point is to make all those reports available to anyone who wants to view them for a year's. The SEC rule requires really a three-step process for companies to go through. First, you determine, does the rule, you go through the list of, am I a reporting company? Do I sell products? Sure, that set of questions. If there's a product or more than one product that apply to you, then you go on to the next step and you determine where your conflict minerals come from. If they come from outside of that covered country region, then reporting companies don't have to go any further, and the reporting obligation is pretty narrow. If they've determined that their conflict minerals come from a covered country, or they have reason to believe they may come from a country, then companies are required to go on to a step 3 of a process, which would require due diligence about the source and chain of custody of their conflict minerals to determine if benefit or finance. That's the goal here, is for companies to determine that. And remember, what's required here is for companies to determine the source and chain of custody of their conflict minerals all the way from the mine to the material, to the part, to the component, final product. And that's a lot of diligence. That's many steps in the supply chain where this investigation is required. And that's why many companies have been out against the rule in the sense of how much is required of companies. So let's talk a little bit again about the impact, for purposes of today. What's the impact of this recycle or scrap exception to the rule? Now, because of the exception to the rule, obtaining 3TGs from recycled or scrap sources will reduce the amount of time and resources that companies have to spend in their reporting and due diligence process. Therefore, the rule has increased the commercial value of recycled scrap sources. So that also promotes e-waste recycling programs so that you can save and reuse minerals. It encourages the creation and expansion of certified recycling and scrap businesses, so it has a real impact there. And all of these factors will lead to an increase in the availability of recycled and scrap 3TG. Companies act as they should. All of that is good in the sense that it makes conflict-free sources more available to companies. But keep in mind that all of that may end up reducing the demand from covered countries. That's one unintended adverse consequence on those individual artisanal miners in the Congo who rely on this mining as a source of their livelihood. So make that point just because, as in many important issues, it's not an easy question. It's not all good or all bad. You want to encourage responsible sourcing of 3TG, one of the ways through recycling scrap sources. But you also want to make sure you're not driving buyers and consumers away from other legitimate sources in the Congo, especially those that are artisanal miners, who are the most vulnerable. I would also say that, just to remind folks, that there is an EU rule that's been proposed. We expect that the EU will start work on this rule by the end of this year, and I could go into more detail comparing to what we think that a final legislative act is probably likely in 2 years at the time it will take. So that's my presentation, and I'll be glad to take questions at the appropriate time on that portion of the program.
Great, thank you, Dynda. Well, Dynda started us okay, Dynda has started us off. We're going to hold on questions to the end, because Dynda's going to stay with us.
And we're going to ask that each of the speakers speak from the seat that didn't see you on the and so we don't have to switch around all mics and stuff. That's okay.
And I'd be happy to advance your slides.
Clicker for the PowerPoint.
So we won't be able to see our slides unless we turn our heads around?
I suppose so.
So, camera?
Is it possible?
We can do that. Give me just a moment to switch the presenter.
You got it.
You're doing well, thank you.
I've been using GoToMeeting to teach a class this semester, so Bill and I have been working. It's perfect.
So we have
Yeah.
okay, so I need to
And she can widen that if she wants to.
we might call it sound for a moment.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead and bring up your presentation.
So is it okay to first?
Yeah, I think with that we're probably do the camera.
So while we're doing this transition, let me go ahead and introduce Deborah Albers, who is the Principal Social Strategist for Corporate Responsibility at Dell Computers. And Deborah's going to move us along the life cycle of our electronic products, from sourcing up the chain, where Dynda started us off, to actually having the product, working with consumers and sellers down the road. I'll pass it to you.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I really enjoyed Dynda's discussion because that's something that's very close to what I do. You know, sorry, I've already lost my train of thought. Let me just advance for a second. Okay, so I work in the sustainability department at Dell, and we could have sent the lawyers. We have lots of lawyers that are experts in environmental law. We could have sent some of the scientists, because we also have environmental scientists that work on our packaging, and we have our environmental strategists, and these are the guys that help figure out our global principles and what we're going to implement over the next 5, 10, even 20 years. But the reason that I'm here today is to talk to you more about collaboration and how we work with other industries. And I'm going to talk a little bit about closed loop. When we went private a year ago, so that's when Michael bought the company back, we had an opportunity to really extend our thinking beyond a quarter or beyond a year. And we implemented our 2020 goals. And it is our position that we want to put technology to work where it can do the most good for people and the planet. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today first about our big 2020 goal. And the idea here is that the good from our product will be 10x what it takes to create and use it. And the math behind figuring that out is very complex, and we don't have complete line of sight to what that looks like. But what we do know is we're not going to be able to do that alone. It will not be specifically because of the actions that we have or because of the contracts, the contractual relationships that we have. It's going to require partnerships with governments, partnerships with suppliers, partnerships with customers, and it gives us an opportunity to look at things a bit differently. So I'm going to talk about our goals. Here's 3 of them that are important. Our 2020 goals actually consist of 21 environmental and social goals. Here's 11 of them, which are all environmental related, but there's 3 of them that you probably will have heard about at one of the panels today. So the first one is to reduce our energy intensity of our entire product portfolio by 80% by the year 2020. Also to use 50 million pounds of recycled content plastics and other materials. So you may have heard about our bamboo packaging, our mushroom packaging, our air carbon packaging, and of course plastics, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And then also to recover 2 billion pounds of electronic waste. And that goal started in 2008. We hit our 1 billion goal about a year ago, and we're going to expand that to 2 billion pounds by 2020. And the problem gets more and more difficult because rather than bringing back a 35-pound CRT monitor, people are coming back with a very lightweight and small iPhone, so that pounds measurement becomes more difficult, and we have to really make an effort to find the sources of these e-waste. So recycling is changing. I mentioned the complexity about the pounds, but also there is a resource scarcity issue. There is an imbalance between supply and demand, and we are trying to offset that by becoming more creative in the places where we look for our source material. Rather than using virgin material, we would like to find ways to use recycled material. Also, the dynamics are shifting. People are beginning to recognize there is value in recycled products. So when you bring back a laptop, there is tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, also known as conflict minerals, but they all hold a value. There's also plastics and glass. And so if there is a way for us to work together to talk about how to use those materials more responsibly, we can then feed them back into products. And those that can't be are often sold on another market, a second tier, third tier, fourth tier market. The idea that Dell has been looking into is closed loop recycling. So if we have a Dell product, or actually any electronics product, and we are able to bring that back, what pieces can we strip from that product and turn back into a new computer? And if we turn it into a new computer, what is the impact of using that recycled material versus using virgin material? Does that cost more in energy to convert it back into a product that we can use, or is that less in energy? Where are these source materials going to come from? How are we going to transport them to the places with which we manufacture? So if we collect something in the United States and then we transport it to Asia, what is the impact of that as well? So it's a complex mathematical program that we are trying to figure out how to make it work so that in the end, our products are delivering 10 times the good of what it costs to create a new one. So we have a three-tiered approach. The first one is arguably the easiest. That is, what are we doing with our own products in our own facilities or where we have a contractual relationship with our suppliers. The next thing we do is at the industry level, and this is really where I engage more. I am on the board of directors for the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition. And the beautiful thing about this particular organization is that we come together when there is a common problem that no one company is going to solve. And conflict minerals was one of the first things that we tackled, but there's also things like slavery and human trafficking, recycling. There's a number of different things where we are really better as individual companies and major brands coming together to solve a problem than any one of us would be trying to solve that problem alone. But then it gets bigger. At that point, you realize what you as an industry can and cannot do, and you are still limited at that point. So you have to engage more people. You have to pull in governments. You have to pull in experts, scientists, NGOs, consumers. And you have to get the system itself to change. Because oftentimes the system is the problem. It has a capacity, it has a limit with which it can function. And so sometimes you have to break the system, and you've got to start with something different. So we'll start off a little bit with what Dell is doing. So I love it when people who have not talked before come up and present something and their numbers match. And so I heard Tracy say between 20 and 50 million pounds of electronics fail to get recycled. Yes, that is the same number that I have, 45.6 million pounds. And I talked a little bit about our desire to pull back in more of that e-waste and use it in a more productive way. That is something that Dell has some amount of control over. This is our kind of version of the circular economy, right? So we have product that is collected, and then we take that product and we sort it. And we have some things that can be reused. They're actually just as good now as they were before. You can take that particular video card, or you can take that motherboard and it can be reused. In some cases, you can actually use the whole system itself. Can be used by somebody who has a lower technical expectation. So you can take somebody who is doing gaming, for example, and then when they're done with it and they need the newest, latest gaming technology machine, that system is still perfect for a college student, or it's still good for a household of some kind. So before you recycle it, you could actually use it again with somebody who has less demand on the technology. And you can continue that cycle. But at some point, then we have to kind of take it apart. And we take the reusable pieces out of it, we recycle it, and people purchase it, use it, and then it goes back into the life cycle again. So I have quite a few slides here, but I think they're all pretty basic. They start off with you processing your electronics and taking them back to a place that can recycle. So most of us here in this room, probably in this country, don't just have one phone or one laptop. We've got a phone and a tablet and a laptop, if not 2 tablets or 2 laptops or 2 phones. And so the process begins with you. When you are done with that electronics equipment, you take it to somebody else who's either going to be able to use it or who's going to be able to recycle it. And Dell has facility location collections in 78 countries, and if you're a business, it's 44 countries. So we talked about some of the minerals that can be used again. Those go to another market and those can be sold. I would really like to see those pulled into a recycling program, and that is a step down the road from plastics once we can prove the system works. But there's also other opportunities like rare earths would be another thing that we could potentially pull in. And they take it and they sort it. Now oftentimes the infrastructure is not in place where we need it to be, and we have to haul it or transport it. So we try to find a responsible way to do that. And earlier today in some of the other panels, I heard them talking about if you're already going to go back to China, can you take something back with you? And that's the method that Dell has used. So when we collect the product and we have extracted the plastics, we put it in empty cargo containers that are on their way back to China. They're lightweight, they transport easily, and then we can get it back to where it is that we needed to have it. Once we have done that, it is melted, it is molded, and it is put back into either the base of a monitor or the back of a monitor. Our Optiflex 3030, for example, has a large percentage of the plastic components are actually made from recycled material, recycled plastics. And then we have actually won an award. Our Design for Recyclability, ISRI, gave us an award not too long ago because this is something that has been difficult to do, and we are trying to do it in a way that is also good for business. We always aim for cost parity or better, same quality or better, and that gives us an argument for our shareholders, our investors, and other stakeholders that we have, because they want to be sure if we ship them a product and it's in mushroom packaging or bamboo packaging, that it is protected, and if it gets dropped, it's going to have the same amount of protection as whatever previous material we were using. So we have to go through rigorous testing to be able to say that the materials that we use have that same strength and protective ability from packaging perspective or the functionality perspective if it's a mineral or a plastic. So from an industry perspective, I mentioned the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition, and one of the things that they work on is they have a sensing mechanism that has been created, and it's basically a materiality assessment for the entire industry. So it takes things that are important to all of the global communities and it matches them up with the businesses, and it says, hey, where do these two things intersect? And how can we find something that's important to everyone? And then work to apply our resources, come up with common tools and practices that can be used globally around the world. One of those examples, again, was to create the EICC and GESI conflict minerals reporting tool, which was for conflict minerals, which Dynda had referenced earlier. And then from a multi-stakeholder perspective, we work with various governments. So just about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, Dell signed on to a partnership related to e-waste with UNIDO, where we have a 5-year commitment to work together in developing countries to help them create and build an infrastructure to handle e-waste. And this is new, and it's not something that we've done before, but what we're trying to do is first build awareness and help educate people on the complexities of e-waste, where to bring e-waste, how it can be handled responsibly. Then it's also about building capacity, so think about the facilities that would be used in order to recycle. And then it is to take that material and find a way to close loop, bring it back into other recycled materials. And so that is an example of how we have engaged from a multi-stakeholder perspective, multi-industry. So I think I'll stop there and then answer your questions.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. So with this perspective, we're going to turn to the regulatory perspective. I'm looking for, oh, I thought I saw you get up. I realized I saw you behind me. So I'd love to introduce Sarah Westervelt to you. Sarah comes, I think, all the way from Seattle, right? Came to be with us today. We're in Seattle. She works for the Basel Action Network, where she's the e-Stewardship Policy Director. And so Sarah's going to help us understand, beginning, I think, at the international level, some of the regulatory structures, scoping down to where we'll finish today with good old Vermont regulations.
Yeah, and just for clarification, I work for an environmental group. We are not regulators, but our work is based on, as Tracy said, an international law. So we're not regulators, but we're very much focused on global laws. I just wanted to say thank you for this. I've just come from the annual e-Scrap conference down in Florida with about 2,000 people, and it's so wonderful to be in this intimate group with such a high level of thoughtfulness and expertise, so I'm enjoying it thoroughly. Thank you. This is the organization I work for. We essentially take this United Nations treaty that I've been asked to tell you about, and we've looked at the two largest hazardous waste streams that are being traded internationally, and that's the focus of our work. And those are electronic waste, which has been my work for the last 13 years, and also ship breaking, the old obsolete ships of any kind that get run up on the beaches in Bangladesh and India. I think you all know, probably better than anyone, that the history of pollution is really about externalizing the full cost, and some folks talked about it earlier this morning, and it really is all about finding someone else to pay for the full impacts of particularly hazardous materials. And we know that due to economic reasons and others that pollution almost always finds that path of least resistance. In other words, the greatest externalization of real impacts and real costs. As the developed world back in the 1970s created the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act and those sorts of things, we increased our disposal cost for toxins. And so, of course, there was this great pressure to then start literally externalizing them out of the country. And so this huge international waste trade, hazardous waste trade activity began, and it's still extremely highly practiced. What happened were in the 1980s, probably many of you in the room were not even alive to be reading the news, but there were many major scandals. This one was in Nigeria. Italy paid a landowner, I think it was $100 a month to house PCBs and solvents and DDT, and a year into it he was dead, and major scandal. The Keon barge contained 14,000 tons of toxic incinerator ash from Philadelphia. It left our country, went to Haiti, offloaded a very small portion of it before the Haitian government said stop. And then it proceeded, I'm not going to go through this, but you can see all of the countries that it went through, and it down at the bottom, 27 months after it left Philadelphia, and after all of these countries refused to take this barge full of toxic ash, it mysteriously disappeared in the Indian Ocean and was dumped. This was one of the sort of last straws for nations who came together to create a trade barrier under the umbrella of the United Nations Environment Program to literally completely ban hazardous waste going from the developed countries to the developing countries. And that was the original purpose. The hope was it would create this complete wall between the rich and the poor. And in 1989, they completed and adopted this convention. 82 countries were there. They gave countries a few years to to transpose it into their own domestic laws, and it went into legal force in '92. What happened, though, is right at the last minute before this convention was adopted, was the U.S. in particular succeeded in, what shall I say, gutting or removing that effect of completely stopping hazardous waste going from developed to developing countries. And instead, it just created a whole prior informed consent proposal. This is and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. This was the 10-year poster put together by the UNEP celebrating the Basel Convention after 10 years. Right now, today, even though we started with 82 countries, there's now 181 countries that have ratified out of 193 total UN member states in the world. And if you don't know, the United States is the only developed country in the world that has not ratified this treaty to restrict the trade in hazardous waste. You can see a few silver countries in Africa that have not ratified either. Some of them are fairly new countries like South Sudan that haven't ratified anything yet. They're just trying to get their feet on the ground. We are the only developed nation that hasn't ratified Basel. Well, what does Basel call for the countries that have ratified it? It has some soft law in it, this 1 and 2. It calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous waste. Don't create hazardous waste to begin with. And number 2 is, if you do create hazardous waste, deal with it yourself. The notion, of course, is if we have to deal with the mess we make, then we're going to have an incentive to create less of that hazardous waste. But you know already that at the last minute, the Basel Convention failed to also say that the developed countries may not trade in hazardous waste with the developing countries. And instead, this formal prior informed consent protocol was set up whereby the government of an exporting country would look at any particular waste shipment and say, okay, we've characterized this particular shipment as containing X, Y, and Z, and they would need to contact the importing government and say, would you please be willing to accept this from us? And so To this day, the Basel Convention only has banned hazardous waste to Antarctica, which is why we don't see a lot of big dump down there. And it otherwise allows any country, rich or poor, to just simply get prior informed consent. The Basel Convention also contains a definition, a set of definitions on what is regulated, essentially if it's toxic or hazardous, explosive, corrosive, and it's headed for either recycling or disposal, it is regulated under Basel. But each country gets to make their own interpretations based on their particular waste shipments. And if there is transboundary movement of waste, it needs to be, in the receiving country, needs to be managed in a facility that's environmentally sound managed. But that's only after determining that that trade is illegal. So what happened in 1989 after the Basel Convention failed to put up that wall is that the African countries in particular were extremely angry, also felt very disempowered, and the organization that I work for is founded and run by a guy who used to work for Greenpeace, and he was there and helped organize these countries to walk out and protest and to come back and create an amendment to the Basel Convention. And it's a separate legal instrument right now. But so it has to be ratified separately by any nation, and it has currently 70-something countries that have ratified, as opposed to the 181 for the full convention. That Basel Ban Amendment, as it's called, does indeed prohibit the export of hazardous waste from the developed countries to the developing for any reason, and it is the basis for our work as an environmental group. The EU countries have all ratified it and transposed that into their domestic laws, so they are by law not supposed to be shipping to developing countries. They're way ahead of us in that they've ratified it and they're trying to enforce it, even though there's, of course, some leakage occurring. Once the Basel Ban Amendment becomes ratified by another 13 or 14 countries, it will become part of the Basel Convention, and from that point forward, any nation that wants to ratify Basel will also be ratifying the amendment and will not be allowed to send from rich to poor. So this amendment is a really critical landmark. It's saying we're not going to be, as a nation that's ratified, we're not going to be allowing free trade in something that's hazardous, just like we don't allow free trade in human trafficking or in endangered species or nuclear weapons. So it's really about not externalizing cost, and it's about honoring the fact that every group of people deserves clean air and clean water, regardless of their socioeconomic status. There's I've just got one slide on this, but there's a clause in the Basel Convention that basically says that parties to the Basel Convention, remember that's about 181 countries, may not trade with non-parties, that's us, unless they're part of some other multilateral agreement. And the US has signed has only signed one hazardous waste treaty, and that's with other developed countries. So in other words, down at the bottom, the effect of that is that it's illegal for all of Africa, all of South America, all the developing countries to trade in hazardous waste with the United States. But we have no legal obligations on us because we haven't ratified any of this. It's illegal for them to receive it from us, and very difficult for them to enforce that as they're the importing country. Here's this famous number that you all have been hearing about. It's from the UN, and it's actually around almost 50 million metric tons. So don't think pounds, think tons. It's really, the point here is that it's just a massive volume, but it's not a hazardous waste problem. I'm sorry, it's not a solid waste problem. So we've got huge volume, but it's actually a hazardous waste stream. And I think many of you all know, especially if you didn't skip 10th grade chemistry like I did, that these heavy metals are immortal. They do not disappear. You know, the mercury may change form, or lead, but it doesn't disappear. And so when we have, and so one of the things that it took me a few years in this work before I started getting this kind of bird's eye view from 40,000 feet, that as a species, I think of us as, in the effort to create these fantastic electronic products that obviously enhance our lives a great deal, what we're doing is we're mining these heavy metals that have been safely sequestered deep in the earth for eons. We pull them up, we put them in products, we use the products for cell phones an average of 18 months, and then we hopefully extend their life, or we throw them away. But whatever it is that we do with them, whether they go in a ditch or a formal recycling facility, they are remaining on the surface of the earth. So we've taken these metals and brought them up, and we're distributing them around the surface of the earth in many, many various ways. We've got all the polybrominated diphenol ethers, these endocrine disruptors that we talked about earlier this morning. Halogenated materials, you all probably know. When you heat this waste stream, you have you create extra dioxins and furans, rare earth metals. In the US, we don't have laws that cover this very well. 25 states have passed e-waste laws, but states have no jurisdiction over export. So they are not able to say, we're going to create this fantastic collection program and we're going to disallow our e-waste to go to China or India. So about 80% of what's collected for recyclers is ending up in developing countries. I'm going to really quickly just go through. In 2002, we did a documentary film showing what's happening to our e-waste in China. This is an acid bath that removes a tiny bit of gold and then dumps the rest of the metals into the rivers. Wire burning facilities. In 2005, we went to Nigeria to document what was supposed to be the new answer. Instead of sending stuff to China for recycling, let's bridge the digital divide by sending stuff for reuse, which, by the way, needs to be repaired first. Lagos, Nigeria is the main port for bringing all of this stuff into Africa. And of course, we found there that they had a great, incredibly skilled workers who knew how to repair all this stuff, but they were trashing it all and frequently around residential areas and burning once the piles got too high. In 2006, we went to Ghana, just absolutely heartbreaking releases of the PAHs and the dioxins and furans. In 2008, finally, 60 Minutes contacted us. We had been unsuccessful in contacting them a few years earlier. And my director, this is Jim Puckett, who founded my organization, went with 60 Minutes and did an award-winning story. They won a lot of prizes. We found that even though we had been there 6 years earlier, they now had moved stuff indoors, where now the occupational exposures were even higher because it was all being still released to the air, but inside. So we know that this externalization is all about really damaging both the human health system and the ecosystem. There are deep social and environmental injustice issues that are underlying all of this. These are some of the impacts I'm not going to go through, but you all know this, I'm sure, in your extensive studies about environmental laws. So just very quickly, what can we do? Well, we could make sure that market prices actually reflect the true cost, the full cost. Like when we buy a new car, we expect that there's going to be, the workers are going to be protected and that we're paying for that responsible management of waste and that kind of thing. One of the other things, since the focus of this symposium is about cradle to cradle, I wanted to just point out a really important caveat. And that is that the hazardous materials really do not belong back in new products. From our perspective, they should be retired in long-term monitored hazardous waste storage. And we know Europe's passing laws to disallow some of these toxins back into new products, but do think in terms of not putting the hazards back into new products. Just wanted to show you, there are some companies who are, like Dell is working on mushroom packaging and some really innovative solutions here. Seuss has just a pilot for bamboo casing, and here's a cardboard. I've seen a cardboard printer as well. Recompute. We've created an e-Steward certification program at the request of leaders in the recycling industry and are trying to identify recyclers around the world who are willing to respect the Basel Convention and the Ban Amendment and never allow the toxins to go from the developed to the developing countries. We know that some of the states here in the US are actually recognizing our program and requiring one of 2 certification programs. Just in closing here, in the process of doing our documentary films, we keep coming across asset tags on various piles of e-waste, sort of afraid we might find some of our own, because we're all contributing to this problem. And that's why I was so happy to see Tracy's flip phone, because I thought she's holding on to her product and really extending that life. When the various folks have gone back to the waste generator and said, where did you think your electronics were going? They said, well, we didn't know. And so, the point is, away is our one ecosystem, and it's all we have, and we are, we have so many reasons, both environmental and health and moral, for managing this waste stream. So we are all gatekeepers when it comes to this waste stream. Be really careful who you turn your electronic waste over to when you're done with it. And if I could just say one last thing here, be careful also when stuff is being exported for reuse to extend the life of the product. It sounds really good. What's happening in practice is that equipment that's going for repair it always generates scrap, and usually it's hazardous scrap, bad batteries, bad mercury lamps, bad circuit boards. And so it's a huge issue in Geneva right now that we're involved with. So we've got to be really careful about not always assuming that reuse is better, if indeed it's going to result in sending the hazardous parts to countries that have no tort law, no infrastructure to deal with this stuff. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Very much. Well, we're very fortunate to round out our panel of experts today with having a state regulator with us. Cathy Jamieson has been the solid waste program manager at VDEC, Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, since 2007. And I know Vermont actually got that name because of the Green Mountains, but we usually think of Vermont these days for all of our green policies. So Cathy's going to talk with us a bit about Vermont's e-cycling program.
Thank you. And thank the speakers for setting the table so well, because I think they really have described the issues that are at hand and the dilemmas that we face, and how I think most people want their materials to be properly managed in a responsible way, but they need some help in doing that. So in Vermont, what we're really trying to do is not use the waste word anymore, but change that perspective from waste to materials. And we have been promoting a sustainable materials management program and vision where these materials can find another use in another life. And so that might mean product redesign. It might mean making sure that when the product is used, it's brought to another facility where it can be turned into valued material. I think all the speakers today have talked about the benefits of sustainable materials management and why it is important. And with respect to electronic waste, the previous speakers really did an excellent job in setting the stage there. There are toxic materials, there's valuable materials, it's a growing waste stream. What's also important is that when your local recycling depot accepts materials for recycling, that can be a cost to that town or that infrastructure, that district. And so that has been a growing cost in electronic waste over time. And that's what was one of the real impetus for us to have a program. So how much have been sold? These are old numbers. I don't think we need to harp on the numbers because, as you can see by the diagrams and all the pictures, this is a growing waste stream. In 1990, when probably some of you were born, we were producing about 1 million tons of electronics sold. That's the weight of electronics sold, not the number of units. And over time, that has really increased. And yes, we have reached a plateau because these devices are becoming lighter in weight, but we are consuming more of them. So we still have an issue with dealing with all of these materials. And so when we're done, when Tracy will eventually be done with her phone, and she wants to hold on to it forever, but it won't last forever. And I know in her heart, she's going to want to do the right thing, right? But whose job, whose responsibility is it to do the right thing? Is it the person that bought it? Is it the store that Tracy bought it from? Is it the manufacturer that made the phone? Is it the town in which she lives that runs the recycling depot? Or is it people like me that run the state agency, or is it all of us? And really it is all of us. We're all part of the use of these materials. We're all part of the demand of these materials. So we all need to be part of the solution. And so what has developed over time are programs, and there's two types of programs that are really out there. One's called product stewardship. And that's where we're focused on looking at trying to reduce or minimize the impacts of the product and the packaging, and thank you, Dell, for looking at the packaging as well, of the product throughout the life cycle. And you'll hear this if you start looking at this industry or any industry, they call it life cycle analysis. And it's not just looking at when Tracy's done with her phone, but it's from the very first part of the production of the phone to the sale of the product, to the use of the product, to then what happens when the product is done. So what are the impacts throughout the life cycle? Extended producer responsibility is a subset of product stewardship, where the manufacturers are required to take on responsibility for managing their product. And the incentive this provides is if they have to pay for a portion of that post-consumer cost of managing the material, they will be more in tune to having that material more cost-effective to manage, having that item to be perhaps less toxic, easier to recycle. So there's an incentive for the manufacturer to be part of the system as well, to make this as a cost-effective system as possible. There's all kinds of types of product stewardship programs and producer responsibility programs, and some are stronger than others. And you'll see that when you start looking at different state programs for different products. Some are voluntary programs, some are mandatory programs. Some have specific goals, and if they have specific goals, then you have to make another decision. Is it going to be based on the market share, or is it going to be based on the types of products coming in? You should have reporting with any program, because you won't know how effective you are unless you collect the data. The convenience. And this is one thing that Vermont really holds as important in any of our programs. You need to make it convenient to the consumer, because if it isn't, you probably will not be effective in collecting much of the material. The cost decisions need to be made on who's managing the cost, who's providing the financing for the system, who's sharing the financing of the system. Is it a share? Who's going to oversee the system? Some of them are government overseen, some of them are by product stewardship organizations. Both of them can work really well. It's depending on how is the system, how is the program put together. And outreach is very important, because people need to be aware of what is available to them. Otherwise, they might be tempted to just do the easy thing and throw it in the trash, because these things are so small. No one's going to see it in my trash, right? And then an audit. Let's make sure that we're working on an effective system and doesn't need to be tweaked or fine-tuned over time. So, like it was said, there's about half the states in this country that have e-waste legislation. They're not all the same. It must drive manufacturers crazy to try to keep track of them all. Part of that is, the manufacturing. We have some product manufacturers that want to, work together collaboratively and come up with one program that they try to work through the states. The paint industry is an example of that. I think the electronic industry is a newer industry. It's very competitive, and they weren't as convinced that working together would be a helpful thing for them to do. So with Vermont, our particular program that we had legislation passed in 2010, it, first of all, it prohibits the disposal of certain electronic devices. So up until that law was passed, you could throw these things away. We didn't want you to, because there were hazardous materials in there was valuable materials in there. Many of our recycling depots were trying to collect them. Oftentimes they charged a fee, and that meant that some of this material either got stuck in storage or people were kind of reluctant to participate. We have what we call a mandatory EPR program. So manufacturers, how do you get manufacturers participating? Well, in our particular law, we require that in order for a manufacturer to sell their product in Vermont, they have to register with us. And then with that registration, they have to pay their share of the fee. So what's their share? We have a market share system, so based on their sales, total sales nationally, and then we prorate it for Vermont's population, and then all the manufacturers participating in a program, that's their share, their percentage of paying for the system. And they pay for the complete system. They pay for the collection and recycling of the materials, and they pay for the agency's oversight. And this is a convenience-based system. When we were looking at what state to kind of copy or steal from in crafting our legislation, we looked at Washington and Oregon, who have convenience-based standards, and we borrowed heavily from those two states in crafting our legislation. And so we do have a requirement for the e-waste to be collected throughout the state and throughout the year. Other states, manufacturers only have to collect a certain number of pounds and they're done, so they could set up shop in maybe the more populated areas, collect for a few months. If they reach their goal, they're done. That doesn't necessarily invite a long-term program that people can depend on. So this is what our program looks like. We have outreach, we have just, posters up there that explain what you can't throw into the landfill, and there's a longer list, and then we have a shorter list of what actually can come into the program. And please excuse the word free. I jump on my staff when they say that because nothing is free. There is a huge cost to this system, but at no additional cost to the consumer, it wouldn't fit on the poster. So, so that's why you see the word free. But it's not free. I mean, someone is paying for it, and with e-waste, it's basically embedded in the cost of the product that you're buying, which is, in my point of view, very acceptable because that makes it more of the true cost of the product, what we were talking about earlier. There is a cost to managing these materials once the consumer is done with them. So what did this program do for Vermont? Prior to implementation of the program, so our program started July 1st, 2011. We needed a year to kind of gear up. Prior to that, we were collecting about 1.6 million pounds of electronic devices a year. Not bad for a state like Vermont. We have some pretty good, we have excellent solid waste district managers out there that are trying to let their staff, their citizenry know about the opportunities. But Vermont, a lot of Vermonters had to pay $10 or $15, and you know, we're thrifty, and we didn't want to necessarily do that. So there's a lot of storage, I think, of e-waste in people's garage and cellars and whatnot. And so when we started advertising that we had this program that people could bring at no additional charge, people started bringing e-waste, a lot of e-waste. And so we collected 5.5 million pounds in the first year, which was phenomenal. It was 3.2 times more than we had before. And we didn't see a decrease. We had a slight increase the second year. We just finished our third year, September 30th, and we don't have all the numbers in. I think this will be the first year that's a little bit less, though. And maybe that's because of the glut of the CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, the large monitors. But we are still seeing a large number of those monitors coming in. And they comprise about 75 to 80% of the weight of the devices that were collected still. How do we compare to other states? We feel that Vermont's had a very successful program. This is, if we look at the per capita collection rate for our first 2 program years, and we selected other states that have had very successful programs in comparison, we have collected more than any other state in any other program year. I don't know if that'll hold true for this third program year, but we've collected a lot. Okay, so we feel like we've done a great change in a short period of time. Certainly not all of our e-waste was going to landfills. Only probably a small bit was kind of going through the cracks. But now we have a system that we feel that affords a lot more convenience for the consumers. It wasn't without having to do a lot of work and having a lot of challenges. This particular piece of legislation requires the agency to be very much involved. Which isn't a bad thing, but we are very much involved. It required us to also come up with procedures and regulations on how these materials are to be managed, and as pointed out, states have limited authority over what happens when it leaves our borders. And Vermont's, small. We don't have a lot of space before it leaves our borders. We had to deal with contracting services, and these are fairly large monetary contracts, so they, of course, got a lot of scrutiny. And then, we still run into people that don't know about the program, so as much outreach as we have done, we know that we need to do more. One of the real interesting or probably perplexing problems, I think, that is pervasive everywhere is the cathode ray tubes. And do I have another minute? Okay, great. Because I would like to touch on this, because this is a real issue in collecting these kinds of devices. Those are the large monitors that contain the heavy leaded glass. Leaded glass has lead. And in the past, what happened was cathode ray tubes used to be recycled into new cathode ray tubes. That market's gone. I mean, no one's buying or manufacturing cathode ray tubes anymore. There is one facility in the world that is manufacturing new cathode ray tubes from old cathode ray tubes, and that's in India. Okay? And they are taking less CRT glass over time. So that market's diminishing. There's one recycler in America that's taking, United States, that's taking CRT glass and using it at a lead smelter, getting the lead out. There's a couple more in Canada. There's another facility in Mexico. So there's really limited options for managing CRT glass. And that became an issue in this contract here. And our contractor said, where are we going to take our CRT glass? And there is one company that has developed a process where the CRT glass is broken down, the lead is immobilized, and it's used in a landfill in the United States. And we did authorize the use of that material. We do not count it as recycling, but it is counted toward the goal of collecting e-waste in Vermont. So there's kind of a difference there, because we never use anything that goes in a landfill as recycling. That would be a bad precedent for us to have. However, we got a lot of pushback all over the place for making that decision. Well, we didn't want to mandate our contractor to export. We didn't want to require, just think of the liability involved with that. To tell your your contractor that they have to export it. We didn't want to tell our contractor that they have to ship it to a facility that doesn't have an end game in sight. And that's happening a lot in this country, that facilities are holding onto CRTs, hopeful that there will be an option in the near future for managing it. There's a EPA federal rule. The longest they can hold on to these things are 12 months. Otherwise, it's called speculative accumulation, and then you're in violation of that law. Companies are walking away from warehouses full of CRT glass, because there's no market for this. And so we did allow our contractor to use the Kusakowski option. It is going to a landfill in Illinois. It's not a great option, but at this point in time, the e-waste keeps coming in. The CRT glass keeps coming in, and without the option of exportation or cumulative accumulation, there aren't many options today for managing this material. So that's, so there are learning materials, and we're trying to do the best that we can. And that's contact information. So thanks again.
Our panelists did, first of all, thank you, Cathy. Our panelists did such a great job in managing themselves that we have a really solid 15 minutes for questions and answers before those cookies start calling our names. So anybody have any questions, either for any of our panelists? Because I believe we're going to bring Dynda back on. There she is.
Yeah.
Who'd like to start off? Did I see your hand up, Crystal? Crystal's busy live tweeting this event, so she's taking a break.
My question is for Cathy, and you mentioned that all of these cathode ray tubes are going to a place in Illinois. Could you tell us where in Illinois they're going to?
Peoria.
That's convenient. That's where I'm from. It's my hometown.
Can I tell you a little bit more about it?
Absolutely.
They're using it as the alternative daily cover to cover the landfill at the end of each day. And what they're doing is taking the leaded CRT glass and coating it with a resin, and then, piling, 9 inches? And using it as alternative daily cover. And as you said, it's just incredible. It's been very controversial. It's cheaper than other solutions, but putting lead in a solid waste disposal facility is part of our concern. But in a way, it may be preferable to put a toxic material in a lying leachate-controlled U.S. landfill rather than exporting it to a developing country. So very complicated issues.
Right. And just, I didn't get into the specifics of the treatment of the leaded glass, but it is tested after it's treated to verify that it passes the hazardous waste criteria, which it does. And then when it's put into the landfill as alternative daily cover, it's also covered with soil. And that's a good buffer because each layer of glass will have soil, and if the lead should leach, soil particles are good at adhering metal, absorbing metal, and so that's another little buffer. And then, like you said, it's a lined landfill with leachate control, and it's here. We're not exporting our problem elsewhere.
Second question.
Well, this is for anyone who cares to comment, but there is, I'm a composter, and one of the things we're aware of is there's a proliferation of kind of trivial use electronics like Christmas tree lights, which now, in order to control their blinking of their little LEDs, have transistors and other electronic components in them. And we see that in wood chips, for instance, because Christmas trees get chipped, and those electronic portions, and many products now have what I'll call trivial electronics. And I didn't hear anything about starting to capture those materials.
Another example of trivial electronics are when we all get on airplanes, we're handed out disposable little earbuds, and they're like popcorn or something. I think that obviously they use metals that need to be reclaimed. The question is, what level of toxins do they have? Do you know anything, Dynda, about in terms of conflict minerals in these trivial electronics?
Dynda, did you hear that question?
No, really, I couldn't, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I can hear your mic really well, though. You could repeat it.
That's because I'm leaping over the dais here to get to this microphone. So the question is do you know about, quote, trivial electronics and minerals used in it? And one example was given in Christmas tree lights, a little transistor. Another example was in the earbuds we get when we go on an airplane ride. Do you know of anything about trying to manage that upstream, before it gets into the products?
I know that certain companies are considering this when they're developing new products, but as far as, when they're considering developing new products, and if it's possible, some of them, I have heard a company say that they're trying to avoid the use of one of these conflict minerals, but it really has to be engineered in a whole new way, and so that's going to take a lot longer to resolve itself. And it may happen. I think ingenuity will mean that people will create new ways to get around things, but some of these are going to be very difficult to replace.
I would just say, I don't think it's on a lot of people's radar screen. I mean, I've just been with 2,000 people just talking about e-waste for 4 days, and it is not on the agenda at all, and I think it should be, so it's a good point. Thank you.
Have any of our panelists talked to the platform manufacturers such as Apple or Microsoft? As an example, I have a second generation MacBook that is still going strong, even after 2 degrees. But at this point, I can no longer upload Chrome. I can't upload any new software that Apple comes out with because they have basically said, oops, too bad, go buy a new computer. So I'm going to hang on to it as long as possible. But, Dell, have you guys tried to get the manufacturer, to get the platform manufacturers to kind of hold off on making our products obsolete in the future?
So it's a very good question. It has come up. It's an unusual position for me working for Dell, but it comes up at the industry level. The idea that we want consumers to be able to use their product as long as they want to use their product, which means not outdating it so much so that they have to get a new system. The complexity associated with that is actually that the hardware requirements for some of the new systems, it's not possible to do it on the older technology. So there's certain times when you can replace a component, a video card in a laptop, for example, or you can come up with another piece that will help you to be able to extend the life of that. But it's really about consumer demand and their unsatiable appetite for the next best, faster, cooler, smaller piece of technology. And so you design your product for the environment to the best that you can. We try to have all of our components be replaceable, so that in theory, although it might be very large, a very large laptop, that you could extend the life of your Dell laptop for a decade or more by just upgrading like a hardware piece, etc. That is much more difficult when you talk about smartphones and tablets. And it's not as possible. So at some point your device, while still working, becomes obsolete. And so there is discussions from other technology companies about what could you repurpose that piece of technology for. Could you use it, if not for a tablet anymore, could you use it as a wireless router in your home? Could you use it as some other piece of equipment? But that's still very new, and it's not an established process. So your point is well taken. It's a complicated problem that's only fed by the appetite for better, faster products.
If I could just add to Deborah's response, there's also an emerging movement called the right to repair. If you go to ifixit.org, Kyle Wiens is very articulate about how all of us as consumers should be able to have access to manuals, to software, hardware that will last and be refurbishable, repair manuals, tools, parts, all of that. So there's this very fairly recent movement that's getting a lot of traction right now. At this conference I was at, it was big deal.
Sounds like the equivalent of the slow food movement for the electronics industry. And clearly I'm a charter member, or we should get together. Anybody else have questions? We still have a few more minutes. Yes, is that Whitney back there?
This is for Sarah Westervelt. I'm wondering about the U.S. Ratifying Basel, what you're thinking about that. I guess in the beginning the U.S. said they were concerned about naval ship passages and some other reasons not to ratify. And now the EPA states that it's an issue with legislative implementing problems, and then also that we're a member of the OECD, and so under Article 11, we're still covered and it's comparable, but what are your thoughts and how does the OECD compare to Basel?
Well, let me start by answering the end of your question. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is sort of the club for the 34 most developed countries in the world, and they have two decisions that regulate trade between those 34 countries in hazardous waste. So that treaty is made only by and for those OECD countries. And so the US, yes, indeed, has ratified and has obligations under it, but it has nothing to do with the United States sending anything to the developing countries. So in terms of the US ratifying Basel, let me first tell you something that may seem a little bit of a surprise, but we actually don't advocate that the United States ratify the Basel Convention, believe it or not, as a separate legal instrument. Remember, right now there's the Basel Convention, which allows developed countries to just get permission to send to developing countries, and there's the separate Basel-Ban Amendment. If the US right now ratified just the Basel Convention, they would never have to respect this. And so, and we know that it's illegal for all these developing countries right now to trade with the US. So we actually do not want to see the United States ratify Basel until that Ban Amendment is part of the convention. We were at an Interpol, you all know the Interpol group working on global issues, many issues, including e-waste. They've got a wonderful task team. They had a meeting in Washington, D.C., and someone asked us to answer that question. Why has the United States not ratified the Basel Convention? And we said, well, we could answer that, but we have so-and-so from the EPA right here. Let's ask him. And he stood up, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, and he said, well, we've readied legislation. All government agencies have agreed to ratify Basel, but essentially we've got this corporate culture that believes that if we in any way restrict trade, that it will harm their businesses. And What's actually truthful is that we've got a lot of very responsible recyclers in this country who have invested millions in shredders, and the kind of companies that Dell and HP and Apple are contracting with, who are wanting these volumes to stay here instead of being exported. They can't compete with the export. So it's really a cultural thing around our businesses saying free trade, we want to be able to sell a load of scrap. We don't care if it's considered hazardous under Basel, we want to sell it to the highest bidder, and usually that's China because they need the metals and the plastics.
Any other questions? I think we have time for one final question.
My question is for Dynda specifically. You mentioned artisanal miners will be those most vulnerable to consumers being turned off from continuing to purchase or consume 3TG products. Can you explain what exactly an artisanal miner is, and as compared to what other kind of miner?
Would you like to come up? Sorry. Since it was so eloquent. I did that.
Dynda, can you hear us all right?
Yeah, I can hear your voice. Well,
Lower
I can say.
So I have a question regarding the artisanal miner you mentioned, that the 3TG may turn off consumers from purchasing these metals from artisanal miners. Can you please explain what an artisanal miner is and compare to what other kind of miner?
Sure. The artisanal miner is the individual. If we were talking about crops, it would be a farmer. It's an individual person who, maybe by him or herself, maybe with a family, a group, will go into the mines and gather the ores from which these minerals are processed. And so throughout a day, a family may end up with a small handful, a cupful, a cup meaning a cupped hand, small amount of ore, and they then sell those to people who will pay them for them. And sometimes they can sell them to legitimate parties, and sometimes they can or they have to, they're forced to sell them to these armed groups. And the real purpose behind the rule is to help that artisanal miner and that farmer mine and source without being harmed, but then also to not reduce the demand for that person, the ore that person extracts. So the real goal is to not harm the individuals, the artisanal miners, and that's the real focus. Although there are also other, of course, legitimate mining companies in those places. Those legitimate mining companies have very good ways to certify that they're good sources. It's those individuals that don't have that much ability.
Thanks, Dynda.
Sure.
Before we break today or take a pause before you head to the next food waste or non-food waste panel, which I love these pithy subtitles. What is it? Oh, right, the Clean Plate Club. So before we resume at 3:45 with the Clean Plate Club, I'd like to do three things. First, I'd like to thank this panel of experts for all that they've brought to us today. On a personal thank you, I'd like to thank former tort student Megan Baxon for having asked me to do this. It was great fun, thank you. And then finally, I want you all to give the love to Megan and Jack in particular. Jack, who conceived this panel, found these folks, convinced them to come to Vermont past leaf peeper peak season. And then all the VGEL staffers, many of whom are former students I see here today, who really put your all into what I think is a terrific conference. Congratulations and thank you.